However, there's some structural things that Dr. King's going to talk to us about to help guide us along as maybe we turn this into a series where we talk about these specifics underlying this subject. And every single one of us, if we've reproduced, are going to be having to deal with this. Any of us who've obviously been born were the effects potentially of this, and that is effective parenting. Tell us a little bit about that, Dr.
Well, we've done this series of parenting in Spanish, and we're going to doing it now in English. And the very few subjects that we talked about that bring so much intensity, fear, emotionality into people, because it's one of those things that everybody thinks we're doing it right, and well, nobody gets educated for it, right? So it's one of those kind of thankless jobs. You get thrown into it without a lot of preparation, and then you do the best you can. And one of the things that comes up often is to define, is there such a thing as normal parenting? Is there such a thing as normal kids? Right. And the reality is that if you look in general, you know, worldwide and culturally specific, we cannot say that there's such a thing as normal parenting, or that there is such a thing as a normal child, or there's a normal father, a normal mother. But we do recognize that there is a wide area of normalcy, right, in which people kind of floats. So we can say there are kids in the range of normalcy, there are parents in the range of normalcy, there are fathers and mothers in the range of normalcy. Now, even though the boundaries of that normalcy is not clearly defined, we have to start with the idea that most parents are well motivated. They have their hearts in the right place. I mean, and I can tell you this because I get to see the product of the ones who don't, right? There are very few, but there are parents who never wanted to be parents and never wanted to learn to be parents. And they're basically, by their nature, have done all the wrong things and that have had consequences. But let's start with the premise that most parents are well intentioned. They really want to do the right thing, but very often they find themselves unaided. They don't have the right tools. They don't have the right education. And unfortunately, and this is probably something that we all have dealt with, the only education we have is our own parents, right? so so we tend to grab a lot from our own parents' assets and deficits, in terms of doing the right thing. And often I hear parents tell me this. They say, well, my parents did all of these things and I ended up okay. So what's wrong with that statement? But the problem with that statement is that you being the judge and the jury, right? I decide what they did was okay and I'm okay. But most of the people that I hear that from will not tolerate a lot of criticism, either of their parents' parenting or their own being well, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind as a framework, right? In terms of where we're going with this when we talk about parenting.
I've not had a child myself, as you know, and partially, quite frankly, was consciously because of how I was raised. I would tend to be like the people that raised me, and that's not particularly nice. I didn't want to pass that on. But even beyond that, but as you know, oddly enough, I became a teacher, a coach, and I've developed the ability to quote unquote parent that way because I always saw that parenting truly was about that. It was about coaching a child, and the goal is to make them better than you. And in order to do that, you have to be brutally honest with yourself and your shortcomings. And if you cannot provide certain aspects to your child, to find it somewhere else. Years ago, I coached a gentleman and his kid, and his kid was not treating him particularly well, but he was really enamored with me for some reason. And afterwards, I apologized. I said, I'm sorry, your kid's acting that way. He said, Vince, he needs a coach, and he won't let me be it. I'm glad you can do it.
Well, you see, I'm a little biased because I tend to see a lot of dysfunction, right? And one of the problems with being a psychiatrist is that um, I see pathology, and I had to be very careful when I walk into describing normalcy because, again, normalcy is a range. But I can tell you by my experience of doing psychiatry and seeing this function for a long time, there's certain parameters that I've learned that are basic when you're going to raise a kid. One of the most basic principles in my book, right? You may not see this in a lot of places, is that you have to understand as a parent that it's not about you. If you're not able to understand that, you need to learn that, right? Because there's a basic idea that most parents have ingrained in their minds is that they want their kids to grow up to be an image of themselves. And it's not our job to make a copy of ourselves. It is our job to educate well balanced, you know, individuals who can be successful on their own and not to perpetuate us, right? When you start perpetuating yourself to your kids, you're putting a pretty heavy load on your kids because you're forcing them to be you, one, and second, their success or failure becomes your success or failure, and you're going to react to that. So, number one, understand that your kids are borrowed, right? God, nature, whoever gave them to you to provide them the tools so they can be individuals, right? With all their assets and deficits that are going to be, and we can spend some programs discussing this, that are going to be influenced by genetics, they're going to be influenced by temperament, and they're going to be influenced by experience. We don't control temperament. That's biologically determined. We don't control genetics, right? But we do control to some degree the experience that our kids are going to have. Number two, it's terribly important that we understand that all of our kids are unique. Even if you have identical twins, each one is unique. It could be unique in temperament, it can be unique on moodiness, it can be unique in behavior. Whatever it is, we have to be able to learn to recognize the uniqueness of our kids so we can tailor their experiences with us in their close environment, right? The best we can to them, not to us, right? So you're starting to see that being a parent is a terrible job.
It's
I
thankless
mean,
for sure.
what is thankless, there are no gold medals at the end if you succeed or you fail, you know. So the reality is that the best we can hope for as parents is well balanced individuals that they can be successful on their own as adults. And I'm not even talking about happiness or success or anything like that. I'm just talking about good, balanced, value people,
You know, it's
right?
interesting you said that because, I mentioned my upbringing. I didn't have the most, I had very neglectful parents and they're very mean. But again, I'll say, judging, I ended up okay. But the one thing my parents have always said to me was like, oh, you turned out to be a decent human being. So even regardless of all the other stuff, they succeeded.
Well, yes, you were not the worst that you could be.
Absolutely.
The question is, do you feel comfortable where you are at? And what happens is that's the number three part, which is that they're balanced in a way that they can transfer information to the next generation in a way that is adaptive, right? That is less painful because there's a component of our being raised, right, that impacts our ability to relate to people, that impacts our ability to be content with our lives, that impacts our ability to be happy with ourselves, right? And don't take me wrong, everybody in life go to some degree of that, right? Actually, I think it's almost a requirement, right,
Mm.
that you have self-exploration and self-questioning, right? And that you change your goals and that you mature and you learn from experience and you make mistakes. Everybody goes through that. The question is, can you go to that based on your life experiences without too much damage to yourself, without too much damage to your soul, and without too much damage to your social interactions, right? So consistency, support are terribly important. The other part that I think is terribly important for parents to understand is that you cannot allow your kids to make you lose control,
Mm.
right? Why is that important? Because each child is different, and there's some kids that are going to be more challenging than others, right? And there's certain kids that are not going to fill the mold of what you expect them to be, right? And you're going to try the most traditional way of changing kids' behavior, which is aggression, right? Whether it's verbal aggression, whether it's physical aggression. And you were a coach, right? You've seen this in coaching, right? When you have a parent yelling on the sidelines,
Yeah.
telling the kid how ashamed he feels of him or her because they're not succeeding. And that is one of the worst things you can do as a parent, right? Because at the bottom of the child experience is the need to have their parents be proud of them.
You
Don't
hear
take me
that
wrong.
over and over and over again in movies and literature. I want to make
Exactly.
my parents proud.
And I hear it from the kids all the time, right? So I see the pathology that comes from neglect, but I also see the pathology for excess recognition. There is something in raising kids that has to do with control frustration. You have to learn how to, in a non-sarcastic, non-demeaning way, learn to frustrate your kids because they need to learn to deal with frustration. And
And they need to be challenged.
exactly. But what happens is that we've gone to the extreme of considering frustrating our kids damaging, right? So we avoid it completely, right? So there are ways that you can teach your kids to recognize frustration and to learn to cope with it, right? So you have to balance the recognition and admiration of your kid with some control frustration. That's a balance to develop a healthy self-esteem, right? You don't want to have your kid grow up to be terribly narcissistic because it demands the recognition, right? And the acceptance of the world because of him or her. Or you don't have a kid that has no sense of self-esteem and thinks that he's responsible for all the ills of the world, right? So it's got to be somewhere in between. And in some societies, in particular in Anglo-Saxon well-developed countries, we see this problem of trying to protect the kids from any frustration, trying to protect the kids from any pain. And the culture of helicopter parenting and putting the kids in boxes, and if the teacher says my kid's bad, I'm going to go and fight with them and report him to the principal, and I'm going to have to protect my kid from the teacher, right? Which never, you and I never experienced that because
But the
our
opposite.
parents, our
They
parents,
always sided with the teachers.
yeah, our parents never protect us from the teachers, right? The other thing that we need to understand as parents is that it's not the teacher's job to raise our kids. It's the teacher's job to educate our kids, right? And we have to be able to tolerate our kids' imperfections, right? Now, we have to balance that with recognition and not with punishment, which is the other mistake that is often made. There's a lot of excessive punishment, and I have to say this is going to sound a little controversial. Most parents don't know how to punish properly, if that makes any sense.
Oh no, yeah,
And I wouldn't
absolutely.
call it punishment, I would call it consequence. So
Mhm.
we need to start changing our wording, right? How do we consequence our kids so they learn something from it? Not how do we punish our kids so they know who's the boss,
Mhm.
right?
Well, punishment intimates that you're doing something to somebody. Consequences intimates that they're actually partially responsible for
And they're learning from it,
it.
right?
Absolutely.
That they have to learn from it. But we, not unusually, put our ego on the line, right? We basically say, is You have to recognize my power and authority, or else. So it comes back to the idea of what is the purpose of parenting, right? And in my business, in the psychiatric world, whether it's biology, psychology, or sociology, we always have to ask, what is my purpose? Is my purpose for the patient to know how knowledgeable I am? Absolutely not. It is my purpose to provide the patient or the individual in front of me with the information so they can live their life more adaptably. It has nothing to do with me. I am a vehicle. So parents are a vehicle to help kids develop more adaptive ways of functioning in their lives. Now, we're talking about average, balanced, normal range parenting, right? We're not talking about pathological extremes or severe neglect or severe abuse or serious mental illness or very challenging kids. That requires a little bit more of education, but I do think that people really need to make an effort to, especially if you're planning to be a parent, to learn to be a parent, right? Not assume that because I had good parents, I'm going to be a good parent. Each one, mom and dad, or couples, have their own uniqueness that is different than their parents, that comes from their own temperament, their own genetics, and their own experience, right?
And their
So
own interaction, right? A mother and father communicating a certain way, being on the same page, supporting one another. We hear the extremes in TV and movies of good cop, bad cop. It's really much more subtle than that.
you see, one of the and I was doing some before this podcast, I was doing some review of um, a lot of the what's being written about parenting in the last few years, right? And everything that I read was about, well, mostly what I read about was about how to build your child's self-esteem,
Hmm.
right?
Should it
It's
be more
really
how not to tear it down?
yeah, I mean it's like we're losing sight of balance. We're losing sight of the idea of allowing your kids to learn to take risks, right? Um, and I think that in part, and it happens in big cities more than in rural areas, we don't let the kids take any risks. We don't let the kids learn from experience. And there's a huge divide that is not necessarily racial. I think it's more economic, right? In which people at the lower economic levels don't have a choice. They have to have one or two jobs, and both parents are working. And we have all kinds of cultural issues that impede the ability of the parents to be present, right? And then we have on the other side, when there's not a lot of financial need, uh, kind of a misguided sense of values, right? In terms of what's important. Let me give you an example. Regardless of people being poor or rich or middle class, when I'm in the hospital, I always ask kids to tell me something good about them. And we talked about this before. Invariably, 95% of the kids would tell me, I'm a good writer. I'm a good, I'm a good at math, you know, I'm good at drawing. None of them can tell me I'm a good human being. None of them can tell me I'm a good person because I'm caring, loving, kind, compassionate, understanding, respectful of authority, anything like that. It's like we've missed that, right? And it's all about accomplishments. Okay. So what happens when the kid's not accomplishing? The kid feels terribly empty, sad, withdrawn. And those who are vulnerable, like kids with anxiety and depression, they get suicidal.
Do you think this is what's led to this, the participation trophies and things of that nature, that we're going to reward somebody even because there is that balance? They do have to be able to succeed and challenging, but you shouldn't punish them for the lack of success, in particular if they don't have the capacity to do the thing they're asked to do.
I'm I've never been a supporter of praising people for failing, right? But I am a big supporter of moving and helping the kids learn how to fail, right? And not feel ashamed of it, right? Because what we do is we go into this over-evaluation and devaluation of the kids' values, I like you when you win and I hate you when you lose, right? So here's the reality of life is that, and you know this better than most people, there are winners and losers, but the losers need to learn to lose, right? I mean, let me give an example that goes outside of parenting, and I think it should be part of parenting. Kids nowadays don't have the slightest idea how to deal with death. They have no experience with grief. Why? Because they haven't experienced that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because for in highly educated societies or very successful first world in particular, people don't die a lot. I mean, actually, during
Well, they
this
do.
COVID pandemic, I
It's
think that
the
this,
first time for a long time
yeah,
that we've had that. Yeah.
there's been an experience. I was observing some statistics. I think this is worldwide. 1 million kids lost their grandparents, right? So, but they haven't experienced that loss. I mean, I'm not talking just about kids. I'm talking about millennials who nobody in their life has ever died.
Yeah, my wife, other than her former father-in-law, until she met me, didn't know anybody. Since she's met me, I've buried 7 people. And her parents are getting old. Her parents are getting old. And the step kid, as you know, she's got like 6 grandparents. The
So
time's
how
coming.
do
The time's coming.
so
So how do
how
you
do
prepare them for that, right?
yeah, how do we educate him to learn that loss is part of life,
Yeah.
right? So we try to shelter our kids from negative, what we call negative experiences that in reality are not negative. They're life experiences, right? That makes them grow as more sensitive human beings. So they
And
can
they're
understand
inevitable.
other, yeah, and they can understand other people's pain, right?
It helps with empathy, sympathy, and all the
Exactly.
things, and all the values we talk about.
Exactly. And I was talking to a patient today who her husband left her, right? And she was describing a typical classic grief reaction, right? It was like the end of the world. She hadn't had a lot of experience with loss. But we need to understand that grieving is not only about death, it's about loss. And everything that we lose something that is dear to us, it hurts. And it's okay. It's okay to hurt. It's not the end of the world. Okay. You don't have to think that there's not life after that. You don't have to think that life has to end for you too because you hurt too much. Right. But I think that we also lost sight of community parenting, right?
Takes a
Uh,
village.
is a village. And I don't want to get into the politics of it's a village because slippery slope. But I do believe that we have to socialize the parenting too, right? You see, what I see with young couples nowadays is a lot of competition of who's doing the right job and who's not. And we need to stop that. We need to start talking as couples, young couples, and I'm talking about my kids, who have children now and my grandkids. They need to talk about how can they help together to have a group that is helping parenting, right? That is challenging the kids and is praising them and is teaching them how to fail. You know? I mean, I go to now to my grandchildren's sports events, soccer and baseball and those kinds of things. And I see a lot of anger. I see a lot of frustration. I think of going to see my grandchildren playing soccer as a joy.
Mm,
It doesn't matter if it's the best or not.
absolutely.
It's about them growing. It's about them learning. It's about learning to deal with difficult situations. Not for me as a grandparent, arguing with another grandparent about who's got the best grandchild. because we get back to purpose. What is the purpose of raising your kids? It's not about us. It's about them.
So
And
really
not
the so really the first step advice I think you would give to anybody would be that disconnect to understand that it is not about you. So when you are dealing with your kids, you're raising them, you're discussing with your spouses how to set your stage that it is about the child and it's not about them and their ego needs to be in check. Would that be step one, really, for basically for anybody?
exactly.
Okay.
And I think a step number two is that once you get to recognize that it's not about you, you can get into the joy of process, right? You can enjoy being a parent because you're processing the best you can for them. Okay. And instead of suffering because they're not doing what you say they're supposed to do. So once you understand that it's not about you, then it's a little easier to implement boundaries, to implement rules, to implement guidance, right? And provide it with empathy and support when they're hurting, right? But not to rescue them because it makes you feel good that you're a rescuer, right? Uh, I've learned a lot from some of the native societies, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, in how they raise their kids, right? And how that the kid becomes part of the community. And I'm not saying that they have other problems, but the reality is that discipline with younger children is not as much of a problem. And that is because kids become part of the responsibility process at a very early age, you know? Go and feed the cows when you're 3 years old. I mean, stuff like that, right? You don't have to go with the kid and make it an adventure every time they see a wild animal, right? Or feed the chicken or whatever, get the garbage out, because the kids grow up with a sense of responsibility. So when we talk about it takes a village, the village can be pretty small, it can be a family,
Yeah.
but everybody has some sense of ownership and responsibility from very early age. So when you tell the kid when they're 10 years old to wash the dishes, it's not a catastrophe, right? Or wait until I finish my video game. Because you trained and you educated that kid because it was good for the kid early in life to start washing dishes after dinner or after lunch or whatever, right? So that process of the village can be as small as a family. And then you start making the kids part of the process of the family so they can learn a sense of responsibility and joy from it. Because if you don't do it early in life, when you try to do it when, well, now they're mature enough, they're 8, they're 9, they're 10, now they should do it, but you're bothering them.
You didn't inculcate that.
Exactly. So raising your kids does not start when they make sense, just it starts when they don't make sense. It starts when they're little, right? So again, I think that we need to keep that in mind and put it in perspective. But we're going to be talking a little more about this as time goes on, and we get a little more into parenting and get into more specific, probably ending with the idea of, okay, how do we do when everything goes wrong, right?
Absolutely.
Which is what I see every day.
Yeah, well, once again, I appreciate your information, Doctor. I'm sure the audience does too. And please, out there, please do comment, like, share, and in particular on the YouTube channel, if you want to hear some specifics of what we're going to be talking about in this series about effective parenting, please leave some questions for us that we can get to if you're not here live on air. And we will see you very, very soon. Thank you,
Thank
Doctor.
you. And thank you to everybody for listening to us today. Thanks. Okay.